Good afternoon. Welcome to the Shoemaker, Loop, and Kendrick presentation regarding COVID-19 vaccination and employers. My name is Grant Dearborn. I'm a board-certified healthcare attorney with Shoemaker. Due to the COVID world that we live in now, much like many of us, I've had to field questions and help companies through COVID responses. So I've been learning some employment law and other things that go along with healthcare. Also with me today is John Burgess, who is also a Shoemaker attorney. John is an attorney and a CPA. John works with employers regarding employee benefits. He also counsels plan sponsors on various compliance matters, including ERISA, the IRS, ACA, COBRA, and HIPAA. Finally, we have Jan Petruska. Jan is the head of the Labor and Employment Group for Shoemaker's Tampa office and has been advising and representing employers in various settings for over 20 years. And appreciate both of you joining us today. We are going to work through this basically on a question and answer basis. We sat down and tried to think of some questions that we think most employers are having to deal with, either just from the practical things that are coming up for them or that employees are raising relating to COVID-19 and vaccinations, particularly around whether employers can require their employees to be vaccinated. I will note that we are recording this today, so it will be available later for replay should you like that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start on our questions. Let me ask this gentlemen. Under federal law, can employers mandate COVID-19 vaccination for employees?
Grant, I'll take that one. Although I think if we can go back eventually to my intro and update that, saying 20 years makes me sound old. So may just say that I advise clients and take that number out. But look, this is an issue we're working through with lots of clients right now about can they mandate a COVID vaccination. And what we're telling clients right now is, like everything else that we've been dealing with COVID over the past year, it's a gray area that will change over time. Just think about every issue that's come up: masks, quarantine, testing, businesses, HR, and us labor and employment attorneys are living through probably the most rapid real-time change of the law that we've any of us have ever gone through. And so I'll give you what we know right now and maybe some expectations. So clients are struggling with, can I require vaccination? Should I incentivize vaccination, or should I leave it alone? Let's be candid. When we get through all of this and get to the other side of it, there are going to be plaintiffs' attorneys and disgruntled employees that are going to claim that we did something wrong, no matter which one of those three paths we chose. And so what we need to do is identify what the landmines are with each of them, figure out what works best for our business model, and move forward. My opinion is that employers can, under federal law, mandate COVID vaccines in the workplace. That's based upon guidance issued by OSHA and the EEOC in 2009, and guidance issued more recently by the EEOC in 2020. In 2009, you may recall, we had the H1N1 flu pandemic, where we had a similar issue about, can employers mandate the H1N1 vaccine? Now, let me first draw a brief distinction here. Remember, the flu vaccine is significantly different than the coronavirus vaccine in the approval method by the FDA. We have emergency use approval for coronavirus, while the flu vaccine's been around for a long time. But in 2009, the EEOC issued guidance that didn't explicitly say we can mandate vaccination, but what it said was, if you mandate it, then you must accommodate employees' sincerely held religious beliefs or disabilities. In 2009, OSHA was also asked, can we require vaccination? And it responded definitively that although OSHA was not mandating it, employers could. Fast forward, and now in December 2020, we got specific COVID vaccination guidance from the EEOC. It basically mimicked their guidance in 2009. Again, it did not specifically say that we could mandate it, but again, said that if employers choose to do so, they must accommodate religious and disability issues. The only concern I have about that EEOC guidance is, remember, it was issued under the prior administration. It was issued in December. We have a new administration. The new administration appears very pro-vaccination. I don't know what its guidance may be on mandatory vaccination, and so we'll have to keep an eye on it. Now, that sounds like a good answer, and maybe we can end right now and everyone go eat lunch. The difficulty with that is vaccination, whether mandatory or incentivized, touches every aspect of employment law, from compensation issues, Fair Labor Standards Act, ERISA, employee benefits issues, workers' compensation. And so I advise everyone to hang on for a little bit while longer as we work through all these different issues on vaccination.
And as you mentioned, Jan, I mean, we are seeing a change regularly in these areas. In fact, I think we're all aware that for a long time, there was no guidance on opening schools. And now we have guidance from the CDC on opening schools. So like you, I think we're only going to expect to see, at least at the federal level with the change of administration, there will be probably some guidance from some of the agencies that have not spoken at the moment regarding, vaccinations and, additional just COVID-19 issues.
Agreed.
So along with that, if we take the next step in this analysis, how does state and local law affect this analysis, particularly government orders that may have been issued relating to COVID-19?
Well, I mean, so every employer is governed by not only federal, but state employment laws, and we always have to take into account local law. I'm the head of the Florida employment law group, so I can tell Florida employers on the webinar, we're not aware of any law under Florida that would prohibit mandating the vaccination. You would have the same accommodation issues under the Florida Civil Rights Act as you do under the ADA or Title VII. For employers that are in other states or are multi-state employers, you'll need to check local law. Just in our, we constantly are looking for information on this. I've seen reference that New York, South Carolina, Washington, and Minnesota have had bills introduced, I don't know yet passed, but bills introduced prohibiting requiring COVID vaccination or making it a term and condition of employment. So again, wherever states you are operating or have employees in, you're going to have to make, do some due diligence and figure out what does your local state also say about this issue.
So one of the things that I've considered about this also is you want to make sure you are aware of those state and local orders, because in essence, one of the places you're trying to get to is if you want to mandate vaccination for your employees, you want to be able to prove that there was a need for it, that there really is this established need for having folks vaccinated. And so to the degree that you have very strong local or state orders that say we have an emergency, this is dire, this is something that we have to, combat like it's World War II, and, on and on and on, I think those orders can be used as part of the analysis of supporting, mandating vaccination for your employees.
Agreed. And in a little bit, we're going to talk about the ADA accommodation issues and what is a direct threat. All of those state and local orders identifying the seriousness of this issue support the direct threat that an unvaccinated employee might present.
So is the next kind of step of this that you've mentioned is how do we review or decide exceptions for disability or religion?
Really good question, because I think this is probably the area that may give employers the most pause in mandating vaccinations. So the EEOC in both 2009 and 2020 has definitively said that employers must accommodate disability and religious belief issues in regards to vaccination. Now, this is going to be the same as, mostly the same, and there's one important distinction I'll go through in a minute, but it's mostly the same as all the other accommodation issues that employers are used to going through. So, you know, you have an employee who needs some unpaid leave or they need a special chair. We hopefully have a process, a policy, forms to engage in that interactive process, get information from the employee, including medical certification, then make a decision about what sort of accommodation we can provide. So all of this is going to be somewhat the same. Where the EEOC went a little bit further, I think, was in this 2020 guidance. They laid out that it is perfectly okay for an employer to have a safety standard that they apply as a term or condition of employment. And they referenced a vaccination requirement as one of those safety standards. But what they said is, if your safety standard is screening out the disabled or people with religious beliefs, the burden then is on you, the employer, to prove that that unvaccinated employee is a direct threat, which has a specific legal meaning. It's a risk of substantial harm to that person or others that can't be eliminated. And so the EEOC says you have to go through this individualized analysis as to the employee and the risk and determine is there a direct threat. But one of the most important things from the EEOC's 2020 guidance was a specific statement that a determination by the employer that the unvaccinated employee would expose others to the virus is a direct threat. So that's really helpful, because we talked about how we'd go out to local state orders and try to build this case. The EEOC seems to be already there. I think the things we have to be thinking about is if and when a majority of our employees are vaccinated, do we still have that direct threat? How about customer or third-party interaction by that employee? Maybe it's not a direct threat if this is someone who sits in an office by themselves and doesn't really have interaction. Maybe we can't show that there's a direct threat. The difference in the disability accommodation based upon this 2020 guidance, though, is there's a quote, I wrote it down because I thought it was really important. If there's a direct threat that cannot be reduced to an acceptable level, the employer can exclude the employee from physically entering the workplace, but this does not mean the employer may automatically terminate the worker. So again, if we're going to mandate vaccines and they are a direct threat, but then we have someone that needs an accommodation, that's not a termination event, is what the ADA or EEOC is telling us. It is more a let's find another solution, exclude them from the workplace, or the EEOC provided maybe that employee has to continue wearing a mask in the workplace or other protective equipment. Also, maybe assigning them to a different position, taking away customer contact, or unfortunately, the EEOC said work from home. So my fear is if we go down the mandating a vaccine path, it's going to result in an increased number of disability or religious accommodation requests for which the EEOC is suggesting we continue to let those people work from home. And again, eventually I expect a large push by employers to bring their workforce back to the workplace. And again, I think this is a little different because if we have a normal accommodation issue in the workplace, non-COVID, the analysis is, can we grant this reasonable accommodation? If we can't, then the EEOC says the next step is there an alternative position that's open and existing? And then if there's not, then there can be a termination event. It doesn't seem that the EEOC is on board with terminating those that can't be accommodated for vaccination issues. The religious accommodation issues are a little less complicated, but more complicated at the same time. So once an employer is on notice that someone has a sincerely held religious belief, we have to accommodate that so long as it's not an undue hardship. And that standard's a lot lower than a disability accommodation. But the difficulty with religious accommodation is normally there's not a certification process. Employers are required to basically accept that someone has this religious belief unless we can show some sort of objective basis that for years someone told us they were X religion maybe, and now suddenly they're a new religion that doesn't allow vaccination. And even then, I'm not sure that gets there because people can change religion. So religion is a little bit easier because there's not as much process to it, but it's a little more difficult because it's a little more certain that they're going to get the accommodation from it. So big picture here, if we mandate vaccination, I think it's likely we're going to have a large increase of requests for an accommodation as opposed to incentivizing it. It is a highly complicated factual analysis on each individual employee. We've been doing research out there trying to gather all the case law we can. There was a case where the court held that an employee's chemical sensitivity was not a disability that needed to be accommodated for vaccination. And yet we found another case where an employee who had severe anxiety about getting vaccinated, that was found to be a disability that might have to be accommodated. On the religious side, there's a case we found that said having anti-vaccination beliefs is not a religion and doesn't have to be accommodated. But at the same time, we found a case that said veganism could be considered a religion and might have to be accommodated as to vaccination issues. So you can see how complicated this all can be as we try to wade through all the different religious beliefs that are out there, all the different disabilities that might be there. And so if we mandate it and put someone's job at risk, I think this is going to increase. I am not saying, however, that if we incentivize it, we won't have these accommodation issues. There is an argument, and we're all trying to figure it out right now, that if I offer you something to get vaccinated and you are physically unable or can't because of your religion, and I refuse to give you that benefit, so $100 to get vaccinated, and I'm allergic to this vaccine, I can't get it. If I don't give you that $100, am I discriminating against you because of your disability? We don't know the answer to that question yet. Multiple trade groups have already asked the EEOC to respond to that question, and we don't have an answer yet. So we're waiting on some guidance from it. But again, overall, my takeaway from this is mandating vaccination will require us to definitely be on our game in dealing with accommodation issues and planning.
So Jan, one of the things I'm hearing along with what you're talking about is we want to plan for what might happen, in which case we want to have a thoughtful process for evaluating, these requests for accommodation. We want to make sure that worst case scenario, if we were sued or an EEOC charge was filed, that whoever we're going to put up to explain the process and explain a particular decision is going to be a person who can speak thoughtfully and well to those issues. So I'm kind of getting from what you're saying that we want to be very thoughtful about how we get to a process and who is included in that decision making on those particular requests, so that if we have to defend them later, we have a good witness, we have a good process, and it seems logical, and we got to a good place, at least with an argument, if we have to defend it on the back end.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Grant. Like, this is not something that we should sort of willy-nilly or arbitrarily enter into. There's 3 different paths, and we can take one of the 3, or even divide up our workforce and decide there are some mandatory vaccination positions, there's some incentivized, and there's some based upon their job duty, we don't need any at all. We may be challenged on it, and so having that documentation to sort of identify, here's what we knew, here's why we made the decision that we did, and that it wasn't arbitrary and is defensible. And the same thing, you know, that's going to help. We'll talk a little bit at the end about best practices, but it's going to help with employee messaging, right? They're going to want to know why we're doing what we're doing and where we're going.
And I think people want to be aware, employers particularly, that the web has lots of stuff on it now. And having worked with a client who mandated flu shots some years ago, they found that, at least in the religious accommodation area, that they were getting a lot of the same requests over and over again, where folks had cut and pasted from web pages, basically from anti-vaccination advocates that cited various biblical or other religious texts for the reason that they were opposed to vaccinations. So you want to be aware that that's out there. It's pretty easy to find if you can use Google. So, you know, folks are going to turn those in. But again, you want to make sure you have a process where you're going to look at that and not just have people annoyed because they're getting yet again another cut and paste, you know, accommodation request, but where they go through the process anyways and make their decision.
Yeah, unfortunately, I equated a lot to one of my, I guess, side areas is I deal a lot of ADA physical accommodation issues. And so that leads me to the service animal or assistance or emotional support animal requests. And there's a whole cottage industry out there of that you can get a doctor on video for an hour and get some sort of prescription for an emotional support animal. That, you know, infrastructure may suddenly be available for vaccination issues as well.
And Jan, can you talk a little bit about accommodations and what those might look like?
Well, again, it's going to depend upon the workplace, right? So the EEOC has identified that we can't just fire someone because they can't get a vaccine. And so we're going to have to work through sort of this process. You know, can the employee continue to work from home? That's probably the easiest one. It may not be the choice that employers want to make, but that's an accommodation. And until we have, you know, herd immunity in the workplace or everyone else is vaccinated, that might be the solution. Alternatively, if someone needs to be on site, continued use of protective equipment and mask wearing in the workplace for that employee that can't get vaccinated. Again, potentially modifying job duties, which again, typically is not a requirement under the ADA for a reasonable accommodation. You do not have to eliminate someone's essential functions. Here, you know, the EEOC used language about temporarily assigning them to different positions or removing duties. So it may be they're trying to sort of get around that general guidance that I normally don't have to change your job. I just have to figure out a way for you to do your job. So, you know, the accommodations are going to be very employer and employee specific. And again, that's why it's that interactive process while we figure out what is going to work here. How long do we need this accommodation for? And, with some accommodation issues, it's easy where an employee says, look, I need indefinite unpaid leave. Well, we have case law under the ADA that says that's not reasonable and I don't have to grant that. But if someone needs a week or 2 weeks or a month of unpaid leave, that might be reasonable because I know it's going to end and we're going to get past this. I don't know how to do that analysis really with vaccination. If someone can't get vaccinated, that's not something that's going to go away, presumably. And so it sort of is a permanent condition. The only, I guess, variable that might change is eventually I may get to a workforce that is 100% vaccinated except that employee, and there's no real risk anymore except to that person. So again, it's going to be a process that has to be worked through.
And as you're talking, one of the things that I'm kind of realizing is that this is not just industry specific. It's actually more detailed than that because, well, you might be a medical office. There's going to be differences in medical offices. If your medical office, say, treats a lot of folks who have AIDS, your patients, therefore, are more susceptible to catching things and more in risk of, if they do, contract COVID, of dying. And additionally, as you're talking about the specifics, if you're in a small office and there are a number of people who have a health condition in that office, and by the way, we're not advocating that you go out and survey your employees and make them tell you, who has what conditions, but there's a lot of times people know, for instance, how many people in your office usually are pregnant. You could have an office with a significant number of pregnant people at the time that you're having to make this decision. You could have, people that have heart conditions, because very often everybody in a small office knows everybody else's problems. And while, I would not advocate you go surveying the office about who has problems, if you know those things, then that, of course, I think can go into this analysis about accommodations and mandating. But I think those are some of the specifics that you have to get into related to the individual person's job, what their office is or their setting is, and their functions as far as interacting with either clients or other coworkers. If you're a data cruncher like John used to be as a CPA, and you hide in your office and you don't talk to anybody, then maybe that's a work at home kind of situation that is the accommodation around a vaccination. However, if you were a number cruncher, but you have to interact with 3 other people every week because you need to talk to them face to face and see charts and whatever in order to get a grasp of what it is you do, then that would be a different scenario.
Yeah, agreed. It's going to be, again, it's going to be a different analysis for every employee and every employer. So what you just said there, though, brings up a good point. You talked about how we can't survey individuals for their health conditions in the workforce. That's correct, right? We're prohibited from making disability-related inquiries. Important guidance, and I had this down in the best practices at the end, but it's important right now. It's related. The EEOC's 2020 guidance did have a very helpful statement. It said that asking your employee if they've been vaccinated is not a disability related inquiry, and it is not in violation of the ADA. Meaning we as employers, we can, under federal law, survey our workforce and ask and find out who has and who has not been vaccinated. Now, the EEOC was also very careful to point out that follow-up questions by employers may get them in trouble. And so the follow-up question of, well, why didn't you get vaccinated? That's likely to be a disability-related inquiry. But we the EEOC is telling us we can do a yes, no, have you been vaccinated for COVID question and not get in trouble under the ADA. Now, again, that's federal law, whether there is a state law issue in that, and I don't think there is here in Florida, but in other states there might be. So.
Yeah, and Jan, just to build on that too, if you, for example, we're looking to bring your vaccination program in-house, like a lot of employers do with seasonal flu shots, we've been doing this for years.
Yep.
You have to be careful about asking any questions about your reactions to the vaccine or any sort of symptoms you may have of that crossing over the line into a disability-related inquiry that's not allowed under the ADA. So again, something to think about when you're making a decision, do we want to provide something in-house for our employees, or do we want to just have them go to a Walgreens, Publix, CVS, whoever, and get it done there, and then ask them yes or no, did you do it?
That's a great point, John. And the EEOC also raised that issue about, sort of those questions you answer before you get medical treatment or get a vaccine about, do you have allergies, this, that, or the other. None of that information should be shared with the employer. And employers also should be careful when you're if you want to get proof of vaccination, that whatever card people are getting doesn't have any other medical information besides, I got a vaccine on this date on it. So really good point, John.
Thank you. And so a follow-on issue to this is about employee compensation and leave issues. How do we get into those, and how do we address those particularly?
Sure. So look, there's compensation issues, whether we mandate this or incentivize, and I'll walk you through the two main ones. And so really this is dealing with non-exempt employees that are required to be paid minimum wage and overtime. So your hourly employees. The Fair Labor Standards Act is the federal law that governs this, and it has a regulation that says that the time that an employee spends waiting for or receiving medical attention on site at the employer's business or at the direction of the employer, if it's during their normal work hours, during their normal work day, that is compensable work time. So we have to at least pay them minimum wage, and those hours would count towards calculating overtime. And so here in Florida, again, we have the news stories all the time about people waiting 6 hours in line at the vaccination site. If we, the employer, are mandating this and it's during their regular work hours and days, that's compensable time, and they have to be paid for that time. Now, if it's incentivized, I don't think that's at our direction, so I don't think we're required to pay for it. But incentivized vaccines have their own compensation issues. So a lot of the news stories we're seeing is some sort of payment or bonus for getting vaccinated. If you get vaccinated, I'll give you $100, right? So this affects or potentially affects an employee's overtime rate. So employers are required to pay their non-exempt employees 1.5 times their regular rate. And regular rate is not necessarily the employee's hourly rate. It's calculated looking at all the compensation the employee receives that week. And one type of compensation that's got to be included is what's called a non-discretionary bonus. And that basically, simple definition of that is, if you do X, I'll pay you Y. If you get vaccinated, I'll give you $100. It's more than likely that that type of bonus or vaccination payment is a non-discretionary bonus and will have to be included in calculating the employee's overtime rate for that week. So, that might be an issue, but I think some big employers have already tried to figure out a way around this, and that's why we see that the incentive for vaccination is not a bonus or a check, but additional PTO days, because PTO days or paying for time that someone didn't work doesn't affect the regular rate. And so instead of giving you $100, I could say, if you get vaccinated, I'm going to give you 2 extra PTO days. Now I don't have to worry about their overtime rate changing, and if they use the PTO days, they go ahead and get paid for those. So those are sort of the 2 big compensation issues we're trying to keep an eye on. There are also some leave issues, right? We hear about employees going through the vaccination process, and after the second batch, they don't feel good. They may get sick for a little bit. They may not be able to report to work. Some clients I've talked to have talked about just adding a PTO day or 2 for 2021, just to deal with those issues. If you're going to do that, don't make it tied to proof of vaccination, right? We just talked about if we tie something to proof of vaccination, now I got to deal with all those accommodation issues. If we're trying to solve a problem, let's not create a new one. Let's just give 2 extra PTO days. Now, all those, we've protected the vast majority of our employees. If they have some sort of issue, they have time off to deal with it. The last sort of leave issue is, remember, it's possible that those adverse effects from the vaccination could, if you're a large enough employer, be considered a serious health condition under the FMLA. We may have to treat it as FMLA leave. And it will also deal with a little bit later. It might be a workers' comp issue.
So we did have a question that I'm going to go back to that came in from one of our listeners, and they were asking what information do we have about what notice we might need to give employees regarding vaccine requirements and reasonable accommodation?
So that's a good question. Generally, under the ADA, there is no requirement that the employer contact the employee about needing an accommodation. The law makes clear that if it's an open and obvious disability, there's nothing wrong with asking, but it's not required. And usually the safest path for an employer is not to raise the issue and instead have the employee come to the employer and let us know they have a disability and they need an accommodation. To sort of guide that process, it's usually recommended that you have some sort of reasonable accommodation policy in your handbook that says, we recognize that employees may need reasonable accommodations for disabilities, pregnancy, or sincerely held religious beliefs. If you need such accommodation, contact HR or someone else. It's usually advisable not to have supervisors be aware of the medical information of the employees they supervise. So we again try to guide that process so that all that information is flowing into HR or some other senior management person to keep it out of everyday supervisor knowledge, and also make sure that the person that gets the request knows what to do with it, right? That's where when we defend ADA accommodation lawsuits, often we find out there was a breakdown in the process. We had an untrained supervisor who just made a snap decision about, no, I don't have to accommodate that, or I don't have to do that, or take it or leave it, rather than reporting it up to HR or something like that. So, sorry, long answer, but short answer is there's no specific duty under federal or Florida law that you have a policy, but it's very helpful. And it's, again, usually our advice that you not seek out or target people and ask them if they need an accommodation, but wait for them to come to you pursuant to that policy. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you. So let's get into another segment of this: employee wellness plans or incentives.
Yeah, so big question that everybody has is it okay to provide some sort of incentive to employees to get a vaccination if you're not going to require it? The answer generally is yes. Now, the tricky part of the analysis, though, is how much can you do? As you may know, if you follow wellness programs, the EEOC is responsible for guidance for that, and those regulations have been in flux for the past couple of years. There had been some guidance issued back in 2016, I think, that was ultimately struck down as far as what you can offer in terms of a wellness program and how much it can go. How big of an incentive can you provide? So back on January 7th, I believe, the EEOC issued some new guidance with regard to wellness programs, and it made it sound like wellness incentives had to be pretty small. They used some examples, for example, such as a water bottle or some de minimis gift card, but not really defining that. Well, those regulations were ultimately pulled when the new administration came in on January 20th. So those are off the board, and a lot of people are asking, what is okay. So unfortunately, there's no clear answer to that at this point. But I will say that a number of employers have been pretty aggressive in terms of what they've been offering. Jan mentioned the example of some employers maybe offering a cash incentive of $100. I've seen reports of some employers going up $200 plus some paid time off in order to get the vaccine. So like I said, there's really no specific guidance here. But I think given the situation, with that we're in, I would expect the EEOC to be a little bit more lenient and willing to allow certain higher incentives than maybe they had been considering before in order for people to get the vaccine, just because unlike with traditional wellness incentives, which typically relate to things like stop smoking programs, the COVID situation has just turned the entire economy on its head. So they want to be able to provide incentives to people to get the vaccine. So again, no clear number out there, but I think people are going to be understanding, and they're going to be able to provide at least decent incentives to people to get the vaccine.
Ken, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that's a good summary of it. Again, wellness programs with them pulling those regulations are in flux, and I, like John, am hopeful that we're not going to have challenges based upon that. That we didn't give someone a water bottle to get vaccinated, but we gave them $100. So.
Right, and the other part of that too is, and I think Jan mentioned this a little bit earlier, was the accommodations for somebody who, for some reason, a disability or maybe a religious reason, that they don't want to take the vaccine. So again, you look at that, and this is typical in wellness programs, where maybe there is an incentive there that somebody is unable to meet for some reason. So you think of some other accommodation for them in order to do it. So as Jen mentioned, maybe changing their work environment, more protective equipment, masks, that kind of thing, so that they can earn that incentive even though they're not getting the vaccine. But again, a lot of the considerations are the same as what you would have with a normal accommodation request under employment law. So just keep that in mind as well.
And one of the things that I've actually seen from a few national employers is in lieu of getting the vaccination, they were allowing people to sit through training. I'm assuming it was some kind of COVID-19 training, regarding hand washing and probably distancing and masking, although I didn't get that level of detail in it. But even if you do that, you want to be careful that you don't make somebody sit through training that looks like it's punishment. Obviously, if you tell them you can either go get the shot or you can sit through 12 hours of mind-numbing training, kind of starting to look like you're punishing them there. Additionally, to Jan's earlier comments, you need to make sure there's equity there about if you're going to make them sit through a certain amount of training, are you paying them or not paying them for sitting through that training? And that's going to go to, in essence, did you pay the person to be in line to get the vaccine? So you're going to want to look at those kind of equity issues if you do those things. So John, did you want to speak to the application of ERISA to a vaccination program?
Yeah, real quickly. Again, this is something that probably is a lot scarier than it sounds, but if you do have an incentive program, and certainly if you bring your vaccination program in-house, as we talked before, your program could be subject to ERISA. Now, most employers who are going to be doing this probably already have some sort of ERISA health plan in place, be it through a major health plan, an employee assistance program, anything like that. You can really take the vaccination program and you should be able to bring it in under the ERISA application. So it's not like you necessarily have to create a new type of plan there in order to do this. So you just need to think about the things that come along with ERISA, communications, make sure the people are understanding the benefits that are available to them, how they can get them, and all that stuff. I doubt there would be any sort of big change to your IRS Form 5500 that you have to file every year. So again, not something that should be a huge headache for you, but just do keep in mind if you do have some of these programs, you may want to make sure that you have it properly brought in under ERISA so that you're complying with all of those rules as well.
Thank you. So let's talk about that one of those areas that nobody really ever wants to talk about, workers' comp. How does workers' comp relate to all of this?
Well, yeah, so that's a good point, because workers' comp has this negative connotation, which is probably very well earned, and employers don't want workers' comp claim. But I think here this might be a little bit different, or at least flip it on its head a little bit. So, what we're concerned about is side effects, complications with vaccination. God forbid something really bad happens to an employee who gets vaccinated. Is it a workers' comp issue? And so we've done some research in this area, and what we've determined is if it's mandatory, we think it's more than likely it's going to be a workers' comp event. So if we mandate vaccination and someone has some sort of injury, then it'll be a workers' comp injury. We also think that if you incentivize vaccination, it likely also will be a workers' comp event. We found a case from the 1960s where there was a hurricane, and an employer suspected that its water at work might be contaminated by typhoid, and for some reason let its employees come to work and drink the water, and thereafter, to sort of fix the situation, arranged for typhoid vaccination. Didn't require it, but arranged it. It was set up nearby, and they could leave during their workday and go get vaccinated. And unfortunately, one of the employees then had a injury because of the vaccination. They filed a workers' comp claim. It was denied. It made it all the way up to the Florida Supreme Court. Florida Supreme Court said, look, this was mutually beneficial for the employer and the employee, and even though it wasn't mandated, this is a workers' comp injury. So, and again, we found another case from the 1990s about a hospital mandating a flu vaccine, and there the court said that was sort of a no-brainer. The employer required the vaccination, therefore the injury from it was a workers' comp injury. So, look, again, workers' comp is not something that we want to happen, but here, this might be a shield that protects employers. So, and again, here I'm talking for Florida employers. I don't know workers' comp law throughout the United States, but in Florida, there's workers' comp exclusivity. The grand bargain that was made between employers and employees is employees will have their medical bills and lost wages paid, but in exchange, they are prohibited from suing their employers for that injury. And so that workers' comp exclusivity may act as a shield that protects employers. God forbid someone gets hurt from a vaccination, they won't be able to sue the employer. They'll have to put their claim in through the workers' comp system. So I know it has a bad name, but workers' comp here might be helpful. But I think we need to work on this a little bit. If you're going to incentivize or mandate vaccines, I think we will have to take a couple steps to strengthen that exclusivity. So in Florida, there's two ways the employee can get around the exclusivity and sue the employer. The first is an intentional tort. If you, the employer, intentionally hurt the employee, that gets them outside the workers' comp system. That's not at issue here. The second one is, best way to describe it is sort of hidden knowledge. That is, the employer had some sort of secret knowledge about the risk to the employee and either hid it from the employee or lied to the employee about it. And so this may be the way that some employees try to get around the workers' comp system and claim that the employer had greater knowledge of the risk than the employee. And so if we're going to incentivize or we're going to mandate vaccines, I think what we should do is educate the employees. The CDC has great resources on vaccination, pros, cons, issues. The FDA has information about the specific vaccines and the risks. When we incentivize, when we mandate, give that information to the employee. That's going to greatly weaken any argument by them that we had secret knowledge, that we hid from them, that we lied from them. We gave them the same information that was available to us from the government, and they made a decision. Therefore, this should remain in the workers' comp system. Now, I say that with employers in the area on the call may have heard about the Publix lawsuit. Publix had a 70-year, Publix, for those that aren't here from Florida, it's a supermarket in the area. They had a 70-year-old worker die in March of last year from COVID. And that employee has filed suit against the supermarket claiming negligence by Publix. Publix filed a motion to dismiss, claiming that that injury was in the workplace and therefore should be covered by workers' compensation. Last week, the court denied that motion and has allowed the lawsuit to go forward. We don't know why, because the decision didn't have any explanation in it. It just said denied. But my guess is if you read the underlying lawsuit, the allegations by the employee are that in March, Publix would not allow COVID sick employees to go home, and that Publix prohibited its employees from wearing masks while at work. And again, these are just allegations from the lawsuit. I don't know if they're true or not, but I think the judge may be allowing this lawsuit to play out a little bit more to see if Publix had greater knowledge than its employees about the risks and made some sort of statements or hid that knowledge from its employees. So that may be what is at issue. But again, I think that education of employees, especially here in Florida, is going to help us, God forbid something goes wrong, push it into the workers' comp system. The last thing, if you're going to mandate or incentivize, check with your workers' comp carrier, right? There's nothing wrong with picking up the phone and call them and say, hey, look, I want to know what your thoughts are on vaccination issues or problems. Make sure they're on the same page with us that it is a workers' comp injury. Also, ask them what notice requirements we have. We talked a little bit earlier about some employees might not feel good for a day or two after the second shot. Is that a workers' comp injury that we have to notify the carrier about? They go out for 2 days, feel better, come back, and then God forbid something more serious develops. Did we lose our ability to report it as a workers' comp claim? Florida generally has a 7-day wait period where workers' comp benefits aren't going to kick in, and I think we have 30 days to report it. So it's probably not an issue, but it's worth at least having a discussion with them.
Thank you, Jan. So that gets us back to something that we've mentioned but not addressed significantly, and that's the OSHA standards, particularly the requirements to provide a safe workplace and the follow-on monitoring that can come from OSHA.
Yeah, so, and this one is sort of in flux, right? Under the prior administration, OSHA, for the most part, sat on the sidelines. There wasn't any binding guidance from OSHA as to COVID issues, but the new administration came in and issued an executive order instructing OSHA to promulgate binding COVID safety rules. That hasn't come out yet, but almost the day after that, OSHA published guidance, non-binding guidance. It's called the 2021 Guidance on Protecting Workers from COVID. If you haven't gotten this document, just Google 2021 Guidance on Protecting Workers from COVID. You'll find it. It's on the Department of Labor's webpage. It's a great document. It sort of walks through all sort of the best practices employers should be doing to deal with COVID. It's a great document to sort of spot check what you're doing and make sure that you're on point. But all this guidance, the 2021 guidance from OSHA under the new administration simply said, make the vaccine available at no cost to all eligible employees, and provide information and training on the benefits and safety of vaccinations. So my understanding, at least here in Florida, is vaccines right now are free for everyone. So I don't know, the first part doesn't seem to be an issue. The second part, provide information on the benefits and safety of the vaccines. I think that dovetails in what I talked about above about the workers' comp issue, that we educate our employees about the vaccines. Here's the CDC link, here's the FDA links, go research it. And that now kills sort of two birds with one stone. We're addressing this OSHA guidance and we're protecting the workers' comp protection.
So with the time that we have left, I'd like to ask, let's talk about some alternative solutions, preparations, maybe some best practices. Sure.
Look, we have to pick a business case. I am firmly convinced that no matter what method you pick, mandatory, incentivized, ignore, it can be challenged later on. So you need to do your own analysis, figure out what works best for your company, your employees, about do we mandate this, do we incentivize it, identify the landmines, and document and prepare a way forward, right? Here in Florida, unless you're 65 or a healthcare worker, we can't get the vaccine yet. All of that is supposed to be changing in the near future. So now is the time to be preparing for this. I'm not sure I'm there personally as to mandating it yet. Again, I think there are much greater difficulties in implementing that with the accommodation issues. The most recent survey that I was able to find was that only 48 to 58% of employees are willing and ready to take this vaccine. Are we practically able to eliminate the rest of our workforce that is going to refuse to do this or have them continue to work from home? And again, I'm not sure the veracity of those numbers, just based upon, anecdotally hearing about people waiting in line or waiting online to try to register for a vaccine. It seems like that number may be too low, but there still will be a significant portion of your workforce that doesn't want to take this vaccine. And if we mandate it, that leads us down the path of accommodations and terminations. I think if we're going to incentivize instead, we need to figure out how we're going to do that, address the wellness plan and or all the compensation issues that we went over. Some clients have talked about first trying incentivizing it, but with the message that we may in the future mandate this. And if once we mandate it, this incentive will no longer be available, to try to build some momentum. I think we need to, as we've said repeatedly, document our sort of path and our decision, why we did, what we were relying on at the time. We've seen how quickly all the information can change. And so identifying that, look, here's the CDC information, it's what it said right now, and that's what we based our decision on. We need very good messaging to employees. They want to know what we're doing, why we're doing it. This is a little further down the road, but I think we need customer messaging, right? I don't know where we're going to get to on vaccination, but I could see a potential future where customers are making a decision about, well, do I want to go to this restaurant or this store based upon, are you vaccinating? Are you not vaccinating? Did you mandate vaccines? I came across an article in December. They did a survey of consumers, favorability rating of companies based upon, are you forcing your employees or mandating a vaccine, or are you incentivizing? The favorability rating between the two was drastically different. Like it was in the 20% for mandating a vaccine versus up in the 60 or 70% for incentivizing. So again, consumers are paying attention to this issue. The last one, again, is just to make sure that all of our supervisors are on point. This is something that we can't have a mixed message. We can't have a forced error. We need to deal with these requests and accommodation issues in a uniform way, have HR handle them. And then again, we talked about multi-state employers. Make sure that, don't just go by federal law. You have to figure out how each one of your states works. So I think that's sort of my best practices. Last one. Remember employment contracts. We dealt with this a little bit. Some of you may have dealt with it during furlough, where we were trying to furlough employees in March and April, and we looked at employees with term employment contracts, and no one had anticipated having to furlough them and not pay them their salary. We were amending employment contracts. Can we mandate vaccine based upon these term employment contracts we have? Can we terminate someone for not getting a vaccine? Does that meet our cause definition under the contract, or suddenly are we going to breach the contract and have to pay severance? So again, something to keep in mind and think about.
Well, thank you very much. And I think we are at that time. We did get some questions, but unfortunately, I think we're at the end of our time. So I'm sorry we weren't able to get to the additional questions. For those of you who have peers who would like to see this, or if you want to rewatch it just because you want to see Jan again, this will be on our Shoemaker YouTube channel. Again, we thank you all for attending. We will look forward to offering some more of these in the future, but we do want to thank everybody for giving us your lunchtime today and your attention. We will be getting out some additional information with contact information for the 3 speakers here today. And again, thank you very much. Stay safe and stay compliant. Thank you all.
Yeah. Last thing, look, if you have questions, shoot them to me. I don't mind trying to, again, give you a quick answer on some of them if I can, or I'm sure Grant and John will do the same. So
Absolutely.
I think you're going to send, I don't want to leave anyone hanging here that you've sat through an hour, and if you have a quick question. So if we can do it pretty quickly, just send it to me and I'll try to respond as soon as I can. So thanks for attending. And again, we're here to help as you work through this process. So.
Yeah, thanks everyone for showing up. Appreciate it.